Good afternoon. And on behalf of Lambton College, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar regarding a coordinated response to access human trafficking in terms of the problem, prevention, and empowerment. My name is Andrea Hands, and I am the Partnership, Strategic Initiative, and Communication Manager in the Research and Innovation Department here at Lambton College, and I will be your moderator for today. This project that Ruth will be presenting about is in partnership with the Sexual Assault Survivor Center in Sarnia Lambton. It was funded by the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council and Social Science and Humanities Research Council through a grant called the Community and College Social Innovation Fund. So this grant is intended to foster community innovation by connecting the talent and facilities capabilities of colleges to address community challenges. And this is exactly what this project did. We will be having a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. There is a chat function that you can type in your questions throughout, and we will be saving them to the end for Ruth to answer. I would now like to introduce Ruth Gertz, the principal investigator of this project.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you everyone who has joined our webinar today, which is on human trafficking, and I'm very pleased that we had such a great turnout. So I will get to the presentation right away because I know you have limited time. Just to start off for everybody's information, for anyone who wants to learn more about human trafficking, there is a really good website called humantraffickedpersons.org, and it's an MCIS free service, free online training on human trafficking. And I encourage anybody who wants to learn more about it to take it. It's a series of training. And also Sexual Assault Survivor Center for any agencies who would like more opportunities to learn more about human trafficking. The public educator is Trish Van Oostrom, and she would be more than happy to help you facilitate any training that your organization would like. To start off, the picture on the front is called The Power of Love. It was, the painting I chose was from a graduate, a social service graduate, who did this about victims. She did the painting as victims often feel powerless when faced with darkness and often don't see their way out. I felt this picture depicted the story of a lot of our survivors who are very much in a dark place and don't feel loved, feel very abandoned and feel lost. So I felt that this symbolically was a good depiction of our survivors and the empowerment that they feel at the end of coming out and exiting human trafficking. So the title of the project was called A Coordinated Response to Assess Human Trafficking in terms of the problem, prevention, empowerment. So I just like to give credit to my great team that I had on the project. Sarah Morrow was my right-hand person, and she was amazingly patient with me and instrumental in getting a lot of the work done and communicating with a lot of our community service providers. Marissa Bray also did a lot of the editing and research on camming and was a great asset. Alyssa Sands was our Indigenous student who offered so much great support in communicating and advocating for Indigenous people that were a part of this study. Leah Fraser is a nursing student and certainly offered great insight to the health and well-being of our survivors and added her own unique touches. And Alicia Rennie, who also provided a lot of great insight as a survivor. The project, I won't go into a lot of detail, you can read the PowerPoint, but the project was initiated by Sexual Assault Survivor Center. And originally they wanted to look at the extent of human trafficking in Sarnia Lambton. But in order to do that, we would have had to interview every single person in Sarnia Lambton. That's not exactly achievable. So what we did is we looked at the problem Is it here in our community? Prevention, what kind of strategies can we look at to prevent it from occurring even more so than we learned that it was happening? And empowerment, how do we empower our survivors, and how do we sustain that in our community, keep it safe? So the project existed from 2018 to 2020. And again, I want to give credit to the federal government, the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada, who fund this project. It's great. The project explored basically 4 demographic areas, and those 4 demographic areas were community service providers in Sarnia Lambton, the survivors, and our 3 First Nations Indigenous communities were all interviewed separately, and our 4th demographic group was Lambton College students. Okay, for some reason, there we go. Sorry. My methodology. So what did we do? How did we do this? So, well, it was a qualitative research project. We did interview 300 people overall. That included a great deal of professionals from the community, from community organizations to police, politicians, healthcare providers, advocates, educators, and survivors, as well as college students and First Nations communities. We did different questionnaires for our survivors, a different questionnaire for our community service providers. We had different ones for Indigenous members, and we used a SurveyMonkey for our college students. So we used a variety of research methodologies to collect the data. We used MaxQDA, which is a thematic coding system to analyze the subjective open-ended questions, and we used charts and graphs to quantify our data. So that was our methodology. I want to refer to this as modern day slavery. Human trafficking is being dubbed modern day slavery. And one of the first questions we asked people in our survey was, have they witnessed either labor or sexual trafficking in their community? And what came out of that is very few community service providers identify labor trafficking as something that they are witnessing or experiencing. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there is no labor trafficking in our community, because a few agencies did identify that it is actually here, and they've witnessed it and have met with clients. But what it does raise a red flag is that it is not being understood, that there are people that are being trafficked in labor, and it's not understood, and there is very little awareness. So it is definitely room to grow and understand much more about that. It doesn't mean it's not happening. So the majority of this research report reflects sexual trafficking. Who did we research and involve? We involved 70 community service providers from Sarnia Lambton, 12 very brave survivors from Sarnia Lambton, and all of them were from our community. However, some of them were trafficked in the States, some trafficked out west, and some were trafficked right here in our community, and some in Toronto. So where they're trafficked was not as important as were they a resident of Sarnia Lambton. 126 college students were surveyed as volunteers, and they did that through SurveyMonkey at the college. And each First Nations community, Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point, Aamjiwnaang First Nation Chippewas of Sarnia, Walpole Island, Bakajanong Territory, and a total of 26 Indigenous community survivors were all interviewed. And on top of that, 58 Indigenous community members. Important to note that all people that participated in the research were volunteers and were asked and consented to participate prior to taking part in it. What is human trafficking? This flyer is a much more reflective flyer of the ones that if you go on the internet and search up human trafficking and hit images, you're going to get a lot of images where young girls are Asian, or they're of Asian descent, or they're handcuffed, or they've got black eyes and they've got tape over their mouth. And I think that's really important, that is not necessarily a true reflection of all human trafficking. A lot of people that are trafficked, yes, they're coerced and manipulated and controlled, and they're very fearful and they are threatened, but they're not always handcuffed the way the images portray. This image is portraying somebody controlling a young person, which happens to be my brother and his daughter, and who staged it for me so we could be ethically correct in what we were portraying. So we did a lot of community education sessions, and we did them jointly with the Sexual Assault Survivor Center, because the more and more we did the research, the more agencies asked for some training. So we did 2 large college information sessions. We did 2 sessions, education sessions at Amjanong, 1 at Kettle and Stony Point, 1 on Walpole, quite a few at Blue Water Health, their addictions team, their occupational health, and the health unit. So in the future, if anybody else would like some training and education, please contact Trish Van Oostrum from the Sexual Assault Center, who will provide free education to agencies who request them. Leads us to the next slide, which is on the definition of human trafficking. So I think it's important that we understand human trafficking as deemed in the criminal code. Human trafficking involves the recruitment, transportation, transfer, or harboring of persons for the purpose of sexual exploitation and or forced labor through the use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, and giving payments. It is known as one of the most complex hidden crimes in our country. It is also the 2nd fastest growing cartel in our country. It is a very hidden crime and very difficult to detect, difficult for survivors to come forward, and difficult for police to make charges, and on top of that, difficult for conviction. It is a very difficult crime, and it is not only just a local crime, it's a provincial crime, national crime, and an international crime. It's just a global issue deeply rooted in social, economic, and cultural causes, putting people who are vulnerable most at risk. What we know. So right now, what we currently know, before we go into this research, globally, every 30 seconds, an individual becomes a victim of human trafficking. These are interesting stats that are down here, but I think what's really important to know is that Ontario is the most problematic province in our country. Definitely, Indigenous peoples are also very much at risk, but our Ontario has 55% of all the human trafficking charges that the police have observed. Big areas are Toronto and Ottawa, but I'm not going to leave out London, Peel, Durham as being some pretty hot spots. What everyone has often referenced our Highway 400 series is the 400 corridors being the high-risk area for human trafficking. Traffickers can load up their girls and take them to Peel, Guelph, Waterloo, London, end up either in Sarnia and Windsor. Then they turn around and they hop back up on the highway and they go back. And they hit those cities because those motels and hotels are right on the highway. So very easy access in and out. And the next day they head back. They go to London, Waterloo, Guelph, Kitchener, Brampton, Mississauga, Toronto, and it can go the East End as well, but I'm focusing mostly on ours. They also go north. They'll go to the 400 series and go north to Barrie and Orillia, and really no city in this province is immune to human trafficking. And some of the things that we knew prior to this research, which I think is important for everyone to know, is the average age is between 13 and 17 in the province, and as early as 8 for Indigenous girls, which is very frightening. Just shows you how much it's in the elementary schools. 70% of the victims identified police were under the age of 25, and that was similar to the data that we found in Sarnia Lambton. And the average victim was exploited an average of 2 years. Those are scary numbers when you think of people being trafficked as for that length of time, the amount of trauma that individual endured. So what I have here is a video, a short 4-minute video. It's done by Covenant House in Toronto, which is a shelter, safe housing for victims of human trafficking. It's a couple of years old, but it really focuses on the romancing recruitment of what is most commonly observed with human trafficking. So it's just a short 4-minute video.
I'm Amy. I did really well in school. I had a lot of friends, but I really hated the way I looked. I started dating Ryan. He just seemed really interested in me. He gave me a lot of attention. He loved me. He just made me feel really good about myself. We talked a lot about what we wanted and the future. I was in love with him. After 2 months, he started telling me he had money problems. He told me his friend's girlfriend was opening a massage parlor, and I should go and work there.
Sex trafficking is when someone is forced to sell sex against their will. This is happening right under our noses. It could be happening to a girl, just like a girl you know. They are lured in public places, schools, malls, and online.
All our victims, to date, have come from Toronto or somewhere else in Canada.
The girls that I work with are 16 to 24. I do get calls about girls as young as 12 and 13 years old. They can be an ace student at school, but still not have self-confidence. So that is a common thread with all girls that I work with.
He told me it would only be for a little while. You know, we would make all this money and buy a house. I was working 12 hours a day. I was in so much pain from having sex.
The way that they lure the girls is to romance them, compliment them that they're pretty, to buy them nice things, to shower them with attention.
Girls, they fall in love with these guys. These guys become their boyfriends at first.
I had this total breakdown. I was crying, and I told him, I don't know if I could do this. Letting these guys be all over me. He was like, you better figure out how to deal with it, because I'm not going to be with a girl who isn't giving me money.
Typically, one girl could make a pimp about $250,000 a year. And that's just one girl. It's very lucrative. It's as lucrative or even more lucrative than selling firearms or drugs.
And I'm hearing conversations like, if we killed her, like we could just bury her somewhere up north and no one will ever find her. I was just so scared. And the thought going through my head is that he really could have killed me.
The trafficker imposes lots of rules on the girls. So they're not allowed to eat or sleep without his permission. They're not allowed to go out on their own. Even if they are, he is watching their every move, and they know not to go against what he's telling them they have to do.
I felt so much shame and guilt. And I still didn't understand that I'd been pimped out.
Some of the red flags to look for when you suspect someone might be sex trafficked. The girl has nice, expensive clothing. She's going out and she's not telling where she's going. Her grades at school might start to slip, and her world becomes more and more secretive. She talks about having a boyfriend in her life, but she's not going to introduce that guy to the family. My hope for these girls is they reclaim their lives and go after their dreams and have a good life.
Our focus on the project included Sarnia Lambton. Oh, it's still coming up. Sorry, people. One of the things that was interesting about Sarnia is that most people really had to say, it's happening here. Are you serious? It's happening in this community. That seemed to be an unusual. Is that okay now? It's showing now?
Yes.
Okay. So that seemed to be the big shock for everybody, that is happening here. And it truly was. Sexual Assault Center really wanted to get this research going because their biggest concern was that they had seen an increasing number of people that were seeking support and services in their community. So they initiated this because they saw the high numbers of clients. So what was learned about the individuals at risk? Basically, anyone is at risk. No one is immune from being recruited into human trafficking. However, it does target vulnerable people. That is your gold nugget to think about who is most at risk. Vulnerable populations, which include youth, women, homeless, two-spirited, LGBTQ, QIA, runaways, disabled, immigrants, refugees, and Indigenous groups. There were over 60 risk factors that were collected in the research, which basically means anybody can be at risk. But the one thing that really stood out for us as the high ones was poverty, addictions, low self-esteem, and youth that are really struggling, seeking love, seeking a better life, seem to be the most vulnerable and looking for something better in their world. So they were the most at risk. Survivors. This was probably the most powerful part of our research. 12 brave women from Sarnia and Lambton, 10 of which were two of the 12 identified themselves as Indigenous. In all cases, they were voluntary. They always had a counselor present, and they were also received a $25 gift card from either Shoppers, Giant Tiger. It was basically their choice. And the referrals could come from any agency, but in this case, they came from the 12 were from Sexual Assault. Ontario Works referred some, Victim Witness, the Good Shepherd, and Circles. Those were our referrals of the 12 people that we interviewed. We probably could have interviewed more if COVID had not hit. However, 12 is considerably a good number. What did we learn about our survivors? It is really important that our survivors really need our compassion, our patience, and our understanding. Every single survivor we interviewed had experienced trauma in their lives, and had carried that with them to a point where it did bring about vulnerability to them, which made them easy to target and easy to be lured into it. They all carried shame, fear. When they were exploited, they lived in fear of escaping. The average age of the survivors we interviewed was 22, which is actually high, and it could be because the youngest one of our survivors was 14. The oldest one was 30 when she got recruited, and that may have skewed our high numbers, but usually it's between 13 and 17 is the average age. In Sarnia, for our research, it was 22. 50% of the survivors that we interviewed were between 15 and 20 when they were recruited. So the bulk of them were recruited as youth. And another big thing, and some of you who have attended Margaret Cape's seminar this morning would have heard how important it is that victims who escape human trafficking, the most important thing they need is safety and their basic needs met, which is food, shelter, and clothing. Safe housing being a huge gap in our community. We also learned that 67% of the survivors did not know, this is a really important point, they did not know they were being trafficked. They didn't even know what was happening to them. They thought they were in a relation. The majority of them, they thought they were in a relationship. This is consistent with all international studies that they believe they're in a relationship. They're looking for a better life. They're looking for love. But then once they get into it with their supposed Romeo relationship, they're trapped, they're coerced, they're manipulated, they're trapped into owing debts for drugs, food, and lodging. They sometimes start off by just having to provide doing fraudulent behaviors, theft. Sometimes it starts out slow and then it's turning into sexual favors for people, for friends. They need to do this in order to pay for the rent, in order for them to drive them around. Often they're not always, they're paid very minimally. They're paid for their food, shelter, and clothing, but they don't reap the benefits of the finances that the trafficker is collecting. Our survivors that we interviewed were the most courageous women that I've met, and they came forward so bravely because they truly want to make a difference in the community. That takes a lot of courage, as you know, to speak out about what's happened to you. To retell that story is so emotionally triggering, but yet these women still chose to share their story because they believed they could make a difference in our community. What did we learn about the traffickers? Well, these lovely faces that have been adorning our media, pretty scary stuff, Nygaard, Maxwell, and Epstein. Not all traffickers look wealthy old men. They can be suave, debonair young men that can root girls. They can also be drug dealers. They come from all walks of life, and basically, just as I said, anyone can be trafficked, anyone can be a trafficker. Often their traffickers use the internet, social media sites, even Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, all those really popular sites. They can use Instagram to recruit young victims, often by getting them to post pictures. I don't know if you've seen some of the news, but Nygaard recruited 80 women over 25 years. And that's the 80 women that they know of. And often all traffickers, what they offer is sometimes they offer money, gifts, and sometimes fame and a career. And Nygaard and Epstein, it was for careers. A lot of them were anxious to get a new career. The trafficker, they're manipulative, they're coercive, they're frightening. And as I said, there's no single profile of who they are. There are three main ways the trafficker recruits. And I call it the 3 stages of grooming. And the first stage is romancing. That's the boyfriend, the Romeo, the offer of love, attention, and status. So romancing is number 1. Number 2, coercion and dependency. Manipulate, threaten, bribe, deprive them of their drugs, deprive them of food, deprive them of sleep. They take away their ID, they take away their phones. They threaten to post things about them on social media. They isolate them from their family and their friends. And the third one is control and entrapment. You owe me. They have to pay debts. They control how and where they live. They're abusive. They're fearful. They destroy their self-esteem. One powerful story a survivor shared was she had shared with the trafficker that she had a bad relationship with her parents, and it wasn't a positive one. And she had experienced abuse as a child from her family. And when he started to abuse her and she threatened to, well, she tried to get out, he threatened her by saying, "You're a loser. No one's looking for you. Nobody cares about you. Nobody wants you." And he used that information that she'd shared with him in confidence against her. And she felt even more trapped and unable to get out of that situation. Some of the girls in our community were promised jobs in real estate out west, a job as a nanny out west, a lot of different ways that they recruited them to get them to go and do what they did. There's also the bottom bitch. Some of them turn into bottom bitches like Maxwell did for Epstein. And a couple of ours were used to recruit, some of our survivors, once they'd been in it a while, were then used to recruit new girls. Then they were used to do fraudulent things, theft identity. And another thing I forgot to mention earlier is the girls don't have their ID with them. They really become almost nameless for the trafficker, and very removed from family and friends and isolated, because that way they can control them better. Here's another video. I'm hoping this one works and that we don't have these sound problems again. So
it's one of the forms of trauma that when you really understand what people are going through and what is being done to them, if you believe in any kind of existential philosophy, I think it is as close to true evil as I have ever seen in my work with people who have been harmed by other people. And I do a lot of work in interpersonal violence.
Every girl is at risk simply because they are a girl. We want all girls educated in the risks about relationships, just like we believe all girls should be educated and have knowledge about human trafficking, so they know what to do. So it's important to have that conversation with girls, not just sweep it under the carpet, never my girl, never her.
There's something unique about the violation of the body. And when I teach about human trafficking, one of the things I talk about is how the body is actually the scene of the crime. So because it is a violation of one's physical person through sexual behavior, there's actually no way to escape it. You can't get away, you can't wash it off, you cannot forget, you cannot get out. You actually take the violated body with you into your new life if you are ever lucky enough to escape human trafficking.
So there's various ways that a girl can be recruited. A lot of ways that we see is what we call boyfriending. So the young girl meets a guy who, you know, she describes as her boyfriend. Guy can build trust, and then he can start to demand things of her. If you loved me, you would do this. And she will 100% believe and describe him as her boyfriend, but in reality, he is pimping her out, and that's probably one of the major ways. And, you know, sometimes they're too afraid to say anything because of judgment from parents and people that are close to them. What would they say?
And so for me, it's such a painful but passionate piece of work. I'm always shocked when I realize how few members of the community actually know that human trafficking is happening underneath their very noses.
So through our strategy, we're looking at prevention through education. So partnerships with the school boards are really important, letting parents know, letting kids know, teachers, educators, that's huge, starting at the base level. And then intervention through our support network. So support services that are working with more vulnerable youth.
Because for every survivor that we work with, every survivor that we rescue, they will tell us about multiple other survivors that nobody has found, that nobody has saved, that has never been able to reach out for help. and may literally never escape the darkness.
That video is pretty powerful. It was done by Peel Regional Police, and I think one of the gold nuggets in that is that it's happening right in front of us and we don't know it. Most, as I said, 67% of the girls that we interviewed didn't even know they were being trafficked at the time. They perceived that what was happening to them was part of the relationship, and that's why vulnerable girls are so vulnerability is such a high risk factor for people. The next section I want to get into is the community service providers that we interviewed, and we interviewed 70 people from 70 different agencies, politicians, healthcare providers, schools, and got their input on human trafficking. And what's really important is that 75% of our community service providers in Sarnia Lambton indicated that they are working with clients who have been trafficked. In our First Nations communities, 100% indicated that they have worked with people that have been trafficked. Really important to know that when there are that many young people that are at risk of being trafficked, and that's male, female, transgendered, all populations groups, they may not be reaching out for help automatically. However, what we did learn is that 40% who finally identify themselves as being trafficked, 40% self-refer. Now, they may be going for other help, for domestic violence, for abuse, for poverty, but by using a trauma screening tool, and Peel Region, Peel Family Services did develop an excellent trauma pre-assessment screening tool that can be used to help determine whether or not somebody's being trafficked. Sexual Assault did sponsor the Peel Family Services last year to come in and do some training around trauma screening, and you can access it through the Peel Family Services. And that, for those of you who want to know more about it, it is highlighted in our report on page 257. But it's the Peel Institute on Violence and Prevention, and they did an excellent job on helping people screen people for that. Another big part of our research definitely identified a need for a community protocol. We have incredible agencies in our community that provide great support to all populations, but it would be really helpful to have a protocol that would enhance communication and coordination of services, collaboration amongst the key stakeholders to best meet the needs of the victims and survivors. First point of contact, who do we call when, do we call the police? Do we call sexual assault? Do we call victim services? That protocol would really help all agencies, determine exactly the next steps to do when they have somebody that is identified. The research we did, I've got to be careful with our time, we did with Lambton College. We interviewed over 200 students. 200 students attended, but 126 participated in the survey. And what we were trying to learn there with our students is, this is the young population that could be targeted. Do they know about it? Do they know what it is? And what we learned was, yes, they do know what it is, and they seemed relatively confident that they knew where to go for help in the community. Most of them referenced the Sexual Assault Center or the police. What was learned from our First Nation communities? So Aamjiwnaang, Kettle and Stony Point, and Walpole Island, Bakajanong territory, all received their own report. They requested that. The reports, the 3 separate reports, because they wanted it to be just about their community, since they provide most of the services to their people within, was provided to each chief through, and that was a recommendation through our research ethics board, that the chief would be the one that would receive it. which was distributed to the 3 chiefs in October 2020. And anybody who is listening to this webinar who would like access to their individual report for their community, they can access it from their chief directly. It was sent to them electronically. And I am scheduled to do a presentation on Aamjiwnaang this month for a particular committee. What happened in our First Nations communities, I will preempt it with most of our information was obtained through Walpole Island before the pandemic. Unfortunately, we were more limited with Aamjiwnaang and Kettle and Stony Point because COVID hit, and I was no longer allowed in their communities, as nobody was, and they had so many things to deal with COVID, let alone doing a research interview. So we didn't receive as much information from those 3 communities, but of what we did, this is what we learned. All 3 communities identified it's happening in their communities. 100% felt it's happening, and they are very worried about it. Very committed communities. They emphasize the need to heal and return to their Indigenous cultures and teaching through understanding their traditional roots, their culture and language, spiritual healing, strive for harmony amongst their people, working collaboratively. What comes out very strongly with them is they believe that human trafficking is deeply rooted in systemic racism and discrimination, colonial violence, the impact of residential schools, cultural breakdown, poverty, abuse, the intergenerational effects of trauma. The 2 survivors we interviewed that were Indigenous, both had experienced a great deal of trauma in their lives. And it's really important that we really have a trauma lens approach to working with all survivors, specifically with our Indigenous peoples. Our justice system, what we learned about our justice system. It's a very profitable and a very disguised crime. As I said, it is the 2nd most profitable cartel in the world. It was an officer with the OPP who dubbed it an invisible crime. Tracking down traffickers is like chasing ghosts. Marilyn Gladue has recently been part of an advocacy group with the federal Liberal government, trying to ensure that judges get more training in human trafficking. The number of charges of who gets charged and who actually gets convicted is very minimal. So what we know from our communities, the community is saying there's a lot of people out there that are being trafficked, but our police are not, the numbers of who's being convicted and who's being charged is not reflective of all of the numbers. Criminal justice system is only a small portion of our human trafficking problem in Canada. So for example, in 2018, Canada charged 78 people across the country of trafficking. Most charges are related charges, which could be fraud, theft, drugs, possession, and then they will have a trafficking charge in there as well. Of the 78 charged in 2018, only 5 were convicted. Now, there are over 400 cases still out there, but such a small percentage. So we really have concerns with our judicial system. The London case I'd like to make reference to in 2019, that was just recently in the papers. This is a London case where a girl was had the courage to come forward and talk about her trafficking with the 3 fellows, Agbadayan, Urgodide, and Lawal. I probably didn't do justice to their names. I apologize. She first didn't show up because she was pregnant, so she had the court adjourned. And the second time she had flu-like symptoms during COVID, and she couldn't go, and the judge threw it out of the court. And those guys walked away. How that happens is we really need to advocate a lot harder for our victims. Court cases depend solely on the testimony of the victims, and yet they fear for their life. They're threatened, and they hash out their stories. It's really painful. They're threatened to be killed. One survivor shared a story with me that was really horrific. She was so scared of leaving because one of the girls that was also trafficked with her, same age, had disappeared. And eventually she found out there was a picture of her in the Calgary paper that they had found her dead. And the trafficker said to her, "You try and run again, and you're next." So they are living in fear so profoundly that they are not even sure if they get away, will they ever be safe. So our overall research findings, number one is our communities indicated they need to continue their efforts. Public awareness and education is number one. And today you attending this is amazing. Those of you who also attended Margaret Cape's presentation this morning, those of you who've brought in sexual assault to do training is awesome. Survivors, they need to have their voices heard. Their stories need to be heard because that will create change. They have the insight and the wisdom to make a difference in our communities. And they should be encouraged to have a role as being a facilitator of change. It helps them heal, it helps them bring closure. But of course, you can only bring them forward to have their voices heard when they have been through some pretty intensive counseling and they're ready. They have to be ready because we do not want to emotionally trigger them all the time. Sex camming, Marissa Bray did this research for us. The reason Marissa added this is during COVID, the police had indicated that sex camming had gone up since adult entertainment centers were forced to shut down because of the pandemic. And so there are an endless number of sex sites, very disturbing. One of them in particular, a beautiful young girl is telling you how to do it, how to set yourself up as an adult entertainment, your own video, how you can subscribe and get your members. And the girls don't know that once they've posted those pictures, even if they only go on once and do it even for a month with a subscription of posting their pictures, that's public property. That is there forever. That they can't turn back that clock. So there's a lot of vulnerable populations who are trying to make their ends meet, who are short of money, who have a drug addiction, and they're bored, they're at home. And we were really concerned during the pandemic when kids were at home doing virtual learning, their incredible access to the internet and what they can see. And as parents, as hard as it is that they can block, still stuff keeps popping up for kids. And it's really difficult. So we're at 4 o'clock, so I want to give time for questions, but I want to go through quickly our 4 areas of recommendations. And there were a lot of recommendations that are in the report, which is you can access it online through the Sexual Assault Survivor Center. Knowledge and prevention services, that was one of our main areas of research. Public education and awareness for the public, for the entertainment, family and friends. Curriculum needs to be in the schools, and not just the secondary schools, in the elementary schools too. And that is probably the most area where funding is required, because a lot of these recommendations do not require funding. But that one would definitely from the Ministry of Education. More education and training for social and health service organizations. I think 90% of our community service providers indicated they would like more training and education. Our justice system, it's not just our judges, it's our crowns, it's our police. Even the police know that they need more training in human trafficking. And then, of course, our consumers, our ACA-Johns, they also, it's like WMIS, AODA training, safe handling. There's so many mandatory trainings that we insist that have to happen, mandatory trainings for new employees. You know, why can't we have a unit on human trafficking as a way to protect vulnerable populations? Second part of our recommendations, our whole category was on gaps in services. And as I said earlier, safe housing. There's wonderful safe housing and great examples in Calgary and Ottawa. Peel region has just set up 2. Durham has one. The closest one we have is in Farmtown, an excellent resource. Free trauma counseling services, very, very important for it to be free and accessible, because as I said earlier, girls or boys leaving human trafficking, they have no money. They haven't made any money, and they often can't go back home because they've been rejected. A lot of them have addictions. Pretty well all of the survivors that we interviewed also had an addiction problem. So along with the trauma counseling, they need rehab. The centers both in Ottawa and Calgary also have detox and rehab right on site, and 18 months that they can stay living, developing life skills, job search skills. So it's not just like an emergency housing situation. We're talking safe housing where they can learn the skills, because if they're recruited at 13 and they're 15 when they get out, they've got education to catch up on. There's a lot that they need, and it's life skills, let alone the addiction. So it could be harm reduction, addiction services, ORT therapy, which is opiate reduction therapy. There's a lot of, it's not just day-to-day counseling, it's detox as well. The community protocol and collaboration, which our coalition of against human trafficking in Sarnia Lambton is currently working on for people to know. And out of that will come a first point of contact in the community, so all agencies know where to refer. An increase in sexual health nurses once we get through COVID, and all our nurses are not just looking after COVID and immunizations and vaccinations, and get back to the real work that they love doing, which is also helping youth. Crisis mental health workers. And we also need short-term housing. Once they get out of the safe housing, where can they go? What can they afford? Life skills counseling. The empowerment of survivors is very important. And two of the survivors did a lot of public presentations, and those of you who read the papers, both Brooke and Alicia came out publicly and shared their stories. And what that did is they both have shared that it was healing for them. Took a lot of courage to do that, but it was healing, that they felt more detached from their trafficker because they felt that they were fighting back and had a sense of freedom, that they could speak out and not live in fear. Sexual assault has a peer support group counseling for trafficked women, and which is a great asset. The trauma counseling, again, sexual assault offers it. Pretty well every agency in our town offers it, but is it, again, we have to be wary of, is it accessible? And the basic needs, the food, shelter, clothing, and their safety is so important. So it's important to walk with them to get a restraining order, a peace bond, if the trafficker is still in the community and could still approach them. So that's important. And of course, some survivors prefer harm reduction. They stay involved with trafficking while they're working their way out. So it's not all an automatic walk away. I'm aware of the time, and I want to give you time for questions. So I'll just do the First Nations. Don't want to disservice them. First Nation recommendations. Again, they all want public awareness and education. They really were strong advocates for survivors really having the insight and the wisdom and the expertise to be a part of moving forward for their communities. They were requiring gender and culture-based training for the police and the courts, and including their local, like the Anishinaabe police and Walpole Island, that they need to be involved in education as well. School curriculums included human trafficking workshops for health and social service providers, in other words, more training, and back to the roots of their culturally relevant traditional teaching and healing. They like the idea of a pre-assessment trauma screening tool. When sexual assault brought Peel Family Services in, it was offered actually at Aamjiwnaang, and there was a fabulous turnout from in our Indigenous communities who attended that. Some of the good work that's already being done is by the Ontario Native Women's Association anti-human trafficking framework they developed, and it is referenced quite a few times in the report, as well as the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report is referenced a great deal in the final reports and in the Indigenous reports as being really good frameworks to work from. I mean, we don't have to start from scratch. A lot of the good work and recommendations are right there, you know, to be accessed. First Nations also recommended more life skill sessions for their survivors to help build their self-esteem, education and awareness for family members about the problem, trauma-informed counseling services needed, financial support for survivors during their exit and transition back to the community, safe and confidential space for counseling. I think that was identified in all three communities that that was a challenge to respect their clients' privacy, that they need more space and confidential space. This was a unique one as well. Engage youth in open discussions to help determine the obstacles and solutions to help prevent vulnerable populations from being lured into human trafficking. Kind of having youth circle groups was really talked a lot about. Detox and rehab is definitely a challenge in First Nations communities. Housing is a huge problem as well. And they would like to see Sarnia Lambton develop a community protocol and potentially use it as a template for them, and so that they can establish their own, but they can also have the wisdom of Sarnia Lambton's protocol to help them. So the efforts to is new legislation, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because some of I think that's been in the paper recently. It's in its first reading, and it's to add to the Anti-Human Trafficking Strategy Act of 2017. There is going to be the Combating Human Trafficking Act of 2021. I encourage you to access any information about that. Some of you may have attended Margaret Cape's presentation this morning on it, but there are amendments to the Child and Family Services Act, and there's also strengthening the ability of children's aid societies, because if kids are in care, they really struggle with restraining them from the traffickers and protecting them from the traffickers. So increasing. So there are some really good measures, but we're running out of time to access that. Another big thing is about the hotels. The new legislation will look at how the police can access information from hotel guest registries to help deter trafficking and to identify and locate victims. Requiring companies advertise for sexual services a dedicated contact, because there's so many websites, like unbelievable number of websites. And Sarah Morrow, when she was out doing the research with me, we were distributing hundreds of a copy of hundreds of websites that youth can access that recruits people innocently to human trafficking. Emergency resources are definitely identified in the report, but Sexual Assault Survivor Center, Victim Services, Women's Interval Home, Sarnia Police, really important. If you see it, you need to report it. And how do you report it? Basically, if you see some red flags and some signs, you need to call the police. You need to let them know that what you see. And I'll just give you a quick example of my hairdresser had said their window is adjacent to a parking lot of a local hotel. They had witnessed a young girl with older men in a car, and you know, they were talking to her. Then she got in another car. Then she got out of that car and went into the hotel. And they asked me what I was doing with myself these days, and I just, out of retirement, don't know what to do with myself. So I told them what I was doing with human trafficking, and they said, "Do you think that's what we just witnessed in the parking lot?" And I said, really good chance. And they said, "Well, what should we do?" And I said, "You need to call the police." You know, the police are saying they do not have enough surveillance cameras They can't put a surveillance camera on every door in this community. But if you see something, you need to call the police. You don't have to prove it. It's like child abuse. Child abuse is not your job. If you suspect it, you would need to report it. And human trafficking, I'd like to say, if you suspect it, you need to report it. And the 24-hour, 7 days a week hotline, 1-833-900-1010, that needs to go out. Even if you don't know your client is being trafficked, you can provide that to any girls, and they will connect you to services. They will help connect you to a lawyer to get a restraining order. There's a lot of services. They will connect you to housing in your community. I will leave you with that while you ponder your questions. The survivors shared their vision. I want to thank the survivors who participated in this research. We need to empower them. We need to hear their voices. We need to get them have the vision to create new paths in our community. We, as those of you who are therapists and social workers, we need to have that trauma lens. We need to be tuned into their addictions, and we need to support them with their basic needs. And these are messages from our survivors. They are the ones who can help, and I believe this research has helped give them a voice, let them know that they're valuable, build their self-esteem, and believe in them, because they will make a difference in our community. Thank you. Sorry for all the technology screw-ups too.
Thank you, Ruth. So informative, and we've had some questions come in. So the first one, would Lambton College be interested in a research project on labor trafficking and domestic servitude in Sarnia Lambton? So I guess I can answer this. Lambton College, we're very interested to supporting, any local initiatives that are happening in our community through research. So if we have the ability and the internal expertise and capacity, we can look to see how we can collaborate and develop a project, and hopefully be able to access some funding to do that. Anyone interested in learning more about that, I highly recommend it. You contact myself, and you can find my contact information on our website through the Lambton College homepage. So thank you. Next question. Proposed legislative changes by the province will require human trafficking training for prescribed employees. Should this training be mandatory in all workplaces without exception?
That's a great question, and that's definitely an ultimate goal for all employees to have that training, because we don't know where the Johns are coming from, right? We're not here to if there is no demand, then there is no need for supply. So by educating the public that that girl that you're having sex with could be your next door neighbor. She could be your babysitter. She could be, she is not necessarily getting the money that you think she's getting. She is somebody that is being controlled by somebody else, and she is not profiting. She's being controlled and coerced. So who are the Johns? Well, they could be anybody. And so the more people we educate about human trafficking, the better our community becomes a much safer community. So, but I definitely believe that, to start off with, the judges, the police need more training. Our social services need more training. And then, of course, our hotel industry and our adult entertainment industry definitely needs a lot more training. So those would be priorities to start.
Thanks, Ruth. Next question. Have you heard anything about traffickers exploiting women on sites like OnlyFans? If so, what are your thoughts on potential legislative changes that could be made to address this? And can this be done provincially or federally?
Well, it's unique that you raised the OnlyFans site, because that's a pretty scary site. That's the actual site that is the one that you can, if you go to that site, one of the first videos you can watch is how to sell your own adult entertainment videos, and how you can get subscribers and share different, and she tells you how you have to talk to the people and how to set up your videos. So legislative changes, the new legislation that I saw have been put forward to me, specifically, I'm just going to go back to that slide where they were talking about what they do hope to do is requiring companies that advertise sexual services to have a dedicated contact to support investigations into suspected human trafficking. They're trying to get on top of the thousands or millions of websites for adult entertainment. And that is a huge, huge challenge. The good news is tomorrow, a couple of key stakeholders in our community were invited to meet with the Solicitor General online virtually with Sylvia Jones. And I will take your question forward and ask that, because I think it's an excellent question and very, very relevant, because what are they going to really do about the massive amounts of adult entertainment sites that are recruiting young vulnerable populations? And I think that needs to be addressed. So thank you for asking that very good question. I promise I will take it forward.
All right. Kelly from Farmtown Courage for Freedom. She wants everyone to know that they have an upcoming 2-day virtual day professional level 3 training coming in April. So if anyone's interested in that, I recommend that you contact them at office@courageforfreedom.org to register to ask questions. And they would be happy to answer the questions you have in regards to that training.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Kelly, for promoting that. That's excellent.
And someone is asking, is it possible to access this presentation in order to use it as a source? Person is currently working on a presentation for their community to access freely.
I don't see any problem with that. You just would have to cite my name, I guess. I'm fine with that. And you can access the report too, which is on the Sexual Assault Survivors Center website.
Could local community patrol teams be established?
Patrol teams, would that be something like a neighborhood watch? Is that what I'm wondering if that's what the person is thinking? It's an innovative approach, if that's what they're thinking. Maybe they can add clarification, but certainly something, it can be addressed to the Coalition of Human Trafficking in Sarnia, and that's a very innovative idea. So I'm happy to take that forward with them. If they want to add more information, what they mean by the patrol teams, please email me. And my email is ruth.geurts, Geurts, @lambtoncollege.ca, and I will forward that to the coalition for you.
Great. Next question is, what advice would you give to parents if they think their child is at risk?
First message is love them. Definitely love them. That is something that a lot of the survivors were asking for. As frustrating as it is as a parent, when you see them getting caught up with maybe the wrong people, people that might be taking them down the wrong path, maybe getting involved in drugs. It's really important that they get the message that you still care about them, you still love them. Keep talking to them. Don't give up on them, and keep giving them the message that you want to be there for them. And there is a boogeyman out there. There are scary people out there, and they can't be trusted. Unfortunately, sometimes kids don't always hear their parents, but sometimes they hear their friends. So sometimes communicating with their friends, and just keep educating them as much as you can, and love them. That is really important. Thank you for that question.
Ruth, I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on how our education system could play a role in prevention.
I know the mental health workers with the school boards are trying really, really hard to get this message out, because it's hard, because the teachers don't even have this information, and the mental health workers are trying to help. Teachers have an instinct, they know their kids might be at risk, and we need the Ministry of Education actually just to take on the curriculum. There's no way that either sexual assault or victim services take on this challenge and try and speak to every single class in every school in this province. They do need to open up their doors more to presentations on these type of topics, but at the same time, with COVID, of course, it makes it impossible. But curriculum, they need to incorporate it into the curriculum across this country. So it's not just provincially, it has to happen across this country. It's not just our school board, because human trafficking is happening in every community in this country. And it's no city is immune. The bigger the city, the more it is. And Ontario is the worst. So what is our Minister of Education? So advocacy to our Minister of Education, once we get through this pandemic, I think we need to take on a bigger advocacy role for curriculum to be developed that is offered, and at grade appropriate levels. So what you would teach kids in grade 3, 4, and what you would teach kids in grade 5, 6, what you would teach kids in 7, 8, 9, 10, it needs to be by 2 grades and age appropriate. And I would think starting as early as grade 4 is very appropriate, and interactive learning, as well as an online system that would be fairly interactive for the kids to do, that would help educate them about the dangers of being lured into trafficking. Thank you. Good question.
What's the best way to bring up the discussion with a youth that you suspect is involved in trafficking?
Oh, really good question. We played around with a lot of different questions with different community service providers about asking, and I don't know if this is from a professional perspective or a personal perspective, because that makes a difference. If it's a child of your own, or a family member, or somebody it's in a personal relationship, I think you need to be really open with them and say to them, asking a very simple question. Do sometimes you feel you can't do things that you're not allowed to do? Are you ever forced to do anything that makes you uncomfortable? Do you get gifts? Do you get money? Do you get anything for being forced to do something? So those kind of questions, very general questions, a family member. But from a professional perspective, even an open-ended question is, have you ever been asked to do something that has made you very uncomfortable? That can be asked as a family member or as a professional counselor. Have you been ever asked to do something for money? Have you ever been asked to do something in exchange for food or for lodging? Has anybody forced you to do something that makes you fearful? So those kind of questions, without saying, are you being trafficked? Because most of them don't know what the word trafficking means. So it needs to be talked about. Have you felt unsafe? Have you felt uncomfortable? Have you been forced to do something that makes you feeling scared?
It's good advice.
Thank you.
The next question, this is a good one. I don't know if you or I have the answer, but to your knowledge, are there grants or incentives available to help with addressing the gaps you've identified in this much needed research?
Oh, that is a good question. The gaps in services, well, most of the recommendations we did make don't actually require a lot of dollars. It requires coordination and collaboration amongst the agencies, amongst key stakeholders. Marilyn Gladju's office and Bob Bailey's office, we interviewed both of them. They're both aware that it is a problem in our community. And I have heard Rob Ford on more than one occasion saying we have to stop human trafficking. I think right now with COVID, a lot of things are on everybody's plate. But the good news is, because I have this meeting with the Solicitor General tomorrow, I will definitely ask about that. I will make sure I share our report from our community with our Solicitor General, but I definitely will ask that question along with the other one I've got on my list about what is available financially. And you're welcome to email me back and ask me, what did I find out? And again, that's ruth.gertz@lambtoncollege.ca. So thank you for giving me homework.
Another question for you, Ruth. How are the traffickers making contact with the soon-to-be victims?
What we found with our survivors, the majority of traffickers were recruiting online, but we also had an incident where it happened in a school. It's amazing that this can happen, that a girl in grade 5 was recruited by a boy in grade 8 who had been given the instructions to recruit, and he was in high school and he was doing it for somebody out, like a pyramid approach. So sometimes the traffickers are children. Sometimes they're like Maxwell, they're the bottom bitch. Quite a few of the survivors had actually played the role of a bottom bitch. They originally had been trafficked and so anxious to get out of it, not sure how to escape, often fall into the role of driving around the other women to do their tricks, and they were driving them around and doing the work. So in terms of recruitment, it can be online. Our social media sites, every social media site out there that you think your kids are safe on are probably not. They're recruiting on Instagram, Facebook. I could go on forever how many sites that they're recruiting, sending pictures, inappropriate pictures of themselves. I think parents really have to teach their kids what they post online can easily become public. What they post to their friend, teaching about the sacredness of their bodies. That's all really important messages for kids to have, because they can be recruited at a school. Interesting that that question's come up, because also the Indigenous communities pointed out how often that their people are recruited at maybe even a powwow, a party, a social gathering, that clubs, bars, like basically they can be recruited anywhere. Just as I said, a trafficker can come has no single profile. So lots of areas, but lots of areas to be concerned about. Good question.
Well, and on that note, I think we've answered all the questions that have come in. So I'd like to start on behalf of Lambton College, first thanking the partner of this project, the Sexual Assault Survivor Center in Sarnia Lambton. I'd like to thank once again NSERC and SSHRC, who federally funded this project. And last but not least, I'd really like to thank Ruth and her research team. Ruth's passion and drive to support victims and to help combat human trafficking in our community is very inspirational. So I would just like to thank you, Ruth, for all the hard work you've done. This project's been wrapped up for a few months now, and Ruth is still working very diligently, getting the message out, disseminating the knowledge that she's found. So we truly, truly appreciate all the work that you've done. And on that note, we're ending at 4:30. I don't know, Ruth, if you have any words that you want to end today with.
No, but I'm sure hopefully everybody's laughing at the problem we have with audio. But that one, I don't know how that happened. But thank you for your patience, everybody. And I'm happy to answer any more questions that you have out there. It's very important. And I just got a quick text from somebody about that only Sarnia Police was identified as an emergency resource. And I apologize. OPP should have been included in there as well. So I apologize, I missed that on my slide, but OPP was very instrumental in helping me get a lot of work done. So I apologize for leaving the OPP out.
And I highly recommend you, if you have the time, to look at the report. It's very extensive, and Ruth and her team have done an excellent job. And as she mentioned, it can be found on the Sexual Assault Survivor Center, Sarnia Lambton's website. So on that note, we are at 4:30, and I would like to thank everyone for attending and wish everyone a good evening.
Thank you, Andrea. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.